Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you all for coming to our webinar. Today we have a very distinguished guest. I'm Professor Abbas from Virginia Tech, and I'm the chair of ASAPA. And I will ask Professor Khalafallah Bushara to moderate this session. Thank you. Professor Khalafallah, please take it from here.
Yeah. Hi, we are very grateful that Professor Buzon accepted our invitation to give this talk. And I'm Khalaf Bushara, I'm a professor of neurology, University of Minnesota. This talk comes in the middle of our third revolution in our quest for freedom and democracy. And it must be said that this has been the pressing issue in all our lives for the last 3 years or so. This revolution is distinct. It is led by our youth with young women in the forefront. We call them Kandakas, or they call themselves Kandakas, referring to the twins of our ancient Nubian civilization. And it's a clear celebration of our ancient past as a way to unite us in the face of all evil. We mourn the loss of our best in this revolution, including just 2 days ago, the death of or the killing of Dr. Mohamed Halawa, who was killed during the peaceful demonstrations on the 3rd anniversary of the Khartoum massacre. So the work in our work about our ancient civilization is quite relevant to everything going on now. And it's often said that when the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind. So we're very, very glad that Professor Buzon is giving us this talk. Professor Buzon graduated with honors in anthropology, magna cum laude from the University of Loyola, or Loyola University in Chicago. She did her master's and PhD in anthropology, University of California, Santa Barbara. Her thesis was titled "A Bioarchaeological Perspective on the State Formation in the Nile Valley." She did her postdoctoral fellowship in anthropology at the University of Alberta, where she worked on strontium isotope analysis of migration in the Nile Valley. She worked as an instructor and honors thesis supervisor at the Department of Archaeology, University of Calgary. And since 2007, she has been at the University of Purdue, Department of Anthropology, where she has been a full professor since 2017. Her research work has been in the area of bioarchaeology, paleo pathology, culture contact, biological and ethnic identity, and environmental stress isotope analysis in the area of Nubia and Egypt. She has published widely and has been a recipient of multiple research excellence awards, including the award from Purdue University, College of Liberal Arts Excellence Award, and she has been a recipient of multiple grants, including grants from the National Geographic Society and multiple grants from the National Science Foundation. She will talk today with the talk with the intriguing title "Life and Death by the Nile: Tales from the Tombs of Tombos." Professor Buzon.
Great, thank you very much. Let me share my slides and make sure you can see that okay. Does that look all right for you?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. I will go ahead and get started then. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to your group. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm excited to learn about this organization, and I'm always happy to speak with people from Sudan. My work in Sudan started when I was a graduate student in 2000, and I have come to make many friends and feel like the town of Tombos is part of my family now. So it's really wonderful for me to speak to other Sudanese and to see that you have some interest in my work. Okay, let me get this going. All right, so today I'm going to tell you some tales from the tombs of Tombos, as my title suggests. Tombos is the archaeological site at the Third Cataract in Sudan, where I've been working for a little over 2 decades. I'm going to give an overview of the site and talk about some of the health conditions that I've documented, along with info about the people who lived there. And I welcome you to check out the webpage for our archaeological project at Tombos. It's pictured here. And we update the blog with news from our excavations and project research, including new findings during our field season. So as you know, the ancient cultures of Egypt and Nubia lived along the Nile Valley in the past. And our work at Tombos focuses on archaeological remains that begin about 1450 BC during the Egyptian Empire of the New Kingdom period. And during this time, we see foreign Egyptian rulers concentrating on expanding their lands to the north and south to gain resources. And Nubia was of particular interest to ancient Egypt because it contained a lot of resources, including gold, cattle, connections to other luxury goods. Egyptian officials and staff established settlements and temple towns in Nubia. And then after the fall of the Egyptian Empire, we have the time period that's often been referred to as the Dark Ages of Nubia, where there are fewer historical records and archaeological sites that have been excavated. Our work, though, at Tombos is shedding light on this picture. So the site of Tombos it was used for several hundred years, as I mentioned, starting about 1450 BC, and it goes through the end of the time when Nubians were ruling Egypt during the Napatan period. These Nubian pharaohs extended their control throughout the Nile Valley north to the Mediterranean and controlled a quite large area of the Nile Valley. So as I mentioned, the site of Tombos is located in Upper Nubia at the Third Cataract of the Nile. You can see it on the map right here. The kind of research that I've been doing takes a lot of people. It's very collaborative work. The main project directors at Tombos include Stuart Tyson Smith at UC Santa Barbara. I worked with Stuart as part of my master's and PhD research. And we've been working at Tombos together since 2000. And I think we've been successful at collaborative interdisciplinary research. And I'll talk about some of the different ways that we approach our research questions. Mohamed Faroug Ali completed his PhD at UCSB in 2016 and co-directs the Tombos settlement excavations. He's currently an assistant professor of archaeology at the International University of Africa. Sarah Schrader was one of my PhD students, completing her PhD in 2013 and worked at Tombos and now at the nearby site of Abu Fatma. She's director of osteoarchaeology at the lab at Leiden in the Netherlands. And Tony Simonetti is my longtime isotope collaborator. And Carrie Gilbo is one of my current PhD students and research assistant on my National Science Foundation isotope project and is assisting me with compilation of data. This work would not be possible without many of the team members and former and current students, as well as our local community members in Sudan. So Mary Mosa was an Egyptian official. He was the viceroy of Nubia for Egypt during this colonial period, and he left many inscriptions along the Nile, including one at Tombos. One of these mentions the recruitment of soldiers for the Egyptian colonial army for a campaign in the territory from the ancient fortress of Bakai to Taroy. You can see here sort of where Bakai is to Taroy. Taroy is located in the area of Tombos. So we've recently documented that Tombos was a large fortified town with a dry moat and wall system founded about 1450 BC. And based on what we found in these recent seasons, we think Tombos is probably this ancient town of Taroy. In collaboration with Donggala University at Wadi Halfa, a team led by Dr. Mohamed Mohamed, we used magnetometry and electrical resistivity to look for buried remains in the town. The ancient town is very much buried under the modern town, as well as the palm grove and other agricultural fields. And we found fortifications that enclose a very large area, about 238 meters east-west to the river, and about 246 meters going north-south. And the fortifications at Tombos are larger than any other Egyptian colony that's been recorded. This is a picture from the tomb of Egyptian Pharaoh Seti I. And you can see in it that ancient Egyptians depicted themselves and the people of surrounding cultures in very specific ways. This drawing in particular depicts what they sort of considered a stereotypical Libyan, Nubian, Asiatic, from the area of Palestine and Israel, and as well as an Egyptian. And you can see how they're depicted differently. Nubians and Egyptians are shown to be quite different in this picture, even though in reality they were much more alike. Similar to what we see in modern times, Egyptians didn't always portray their enemies, such as Nubians, entirely positively or in truthful ways. So you can see here King Tut's sandals with images of foreign prisoners. You can see them here, their hands are tied. And they were placed on his shoes so he could step on them every day. Certainly not a positive depiction. This is an example from World War II. You can see how the enemy is portrayed in World War II in American propaganda. And I grew up hearing a lot about World War II in my childhood. My father is an immigrant from the Philippines who grew up in Japanese-occupied Manila. So thinking about that chronological context of Egyptians and Nubians during this colonial period and the period when Nubia ruled Egypt, I'm using archaeology to try to understand who was buried at the site of Tombos. And we use practices associated with burial as one way to explore identity. Funerary practices of Egyptians and Nubians in the past tended to be quite different. So usually Egyptians were buried in an extended position, like you see here. And they were usually laying on their back. They often were buried in tomb chapels and pyramids, especially for the wealthy individuals. And Egyptian burials usually included some specialized grave goods that are designed to aid the deceased in the afterlife, reflecting some Egyptian religious ideas. Nubian burials tended to be more usually in a flexed position, like this one here, laying on their side, often placed on a bed or cowhide, and buried under a tumulus, this mound of stones, a circular mound that's decorated. So what do these patterns tell us about who lived at Tombos? We see both Egyptian and Nubian traditions. So while we know that this site was likely established by the Egyptians during the colonial period, it wasn't just Egyptians who lived here. We have some Egyptian style pyramid tombs and chapel tombs in this area here, in this western area, a dozen or so pyramids. We have some Egyptian style chamber tombs in this area up here in the north. And then in the yellow over to the east here, we have Nubian style tumulus graves. So Tombos appears more Egyptian at the start of its use, but over time we see many Nubian practices, such as this field of tumulus graves, and it becomes more common over time. During the post-Egyptian period at Tombos, so after the end of the Egyptian Empire, we see a blending of traditional Egyptian and Nubian cultural features. Egyptian colonists settled at Tombos during the New Kingdom, but it's clear that they worked together with local Nubians to create this multicultural and biologically mixed community that continued to thrive long after the fall of the Egyptian Empire and the end of the colonial government. This burial included both an Egyptian style coffin in yellow here, as well as a more Nubian style bed, the red rectangular outline here. There's pottery, bronze bowls, a very fancy wooden box, and this box contained intricately carved vessels here, ceramic vessels. And these amazing vessels are actually currently on loan to the Louvre Museum in Paris as part of their Nubian exhibit, which is on at the Louvre right now through July. This individual also had a large collection of iron weapons, some of the earliest ones found in Nubia. In reconstructing who lived at Tombos, we search for multiple lines of evidence. So another source of data to identify immigrants in archaeological sites is strontium isotope analysis. Strontium is an element, and the concentrations of strontium and the ratios of the different versions of strontium differ according to variations in local geology. Strontium is present in soil and groundwater and is incorporated into the local plants and animals and people. And my work at Tombos has established the strontium variability in the region and provided some baseline data for the development of the method in this region. During the Egyptian rule of Nubia, we have evidence that immigrants came to Nubia from Egypt. At Tombos, we have pretty fine chronological control determined from artifacts that have pharaohs' names on them, as well as some ceramic styles. And we can date individual layers of burials within a tomb. And looking at strontium isotope values, we seem to find that there are more Egyptians during earlier periods. So this blue here, during the early periods of the site, and then it sort of drops off to not as many over time. So it seems like most of the Egyptian immigrants came when the community was being established, and then over time there weren't as many. Biological variability, as traced through the shape and size of skulls and teeth, provides some additional clues about population composition. Data from Tombos show that the site wasn't just a group of Egyptian immigrants living in isolation, but that they likely intermarried and formed a new community with the local Nubians. So through the combined analyses of burial practices, strontium isotopes, and biological variability, we can look at the social factors that were involved in the transformations of population composition over time that led to new patterns of identity at Tombos that were neither wholly Egyptian or wholly Nubian. Egyptians didn't just leave at the end of the empire, as some have suggested. After a few hundred years, those Egyptian immigrants and their offspring and their subsequent generations probably considered Nubia home, and perhaps these differences weren't so conscious anymore to the people who lived there. I'm also interested in reconstructing a picture of health and disease and life experiences for the people that I research. Paleo Pathology is the study of ancient disease and provides some methods to trace these signs. It's very uncommon to be able to determine the cause of death of a skeleton, but we can document injuries, both accidental and traumatic, as well as other conditions that people lived with. In general, the community at Tombos led lives that didn't include many physical injuries or evidence of very tough physical labor. So generally speaking, they lived pretty good lives. You'll see in the coming slides, there are some people at Tombos that appear to come from quite affluent status. Maybe some of these burials would represent administrative bureaucrats and other skilled workers, but we also likely have some household staff members who would have been considered lower class. The preservation of organic materials is fairly poor in many of these burials due to termites that eat up everything, as well as some of the damp conditions that we found in some of these deep graves where the groundwater has started to seep in. Nearly all of the tombs and pits in the northern and western cemetery areas reveal evidence of wood coffins. This is generally considered an Egyptian burial tradition. But we also see beds associated with Nubian practices, somewhat more rare in these areas. You can see in this picture here, this is the remains of a bed leg that's still preserved. We also see evidence of coffins. So you can see a wooden coffin in this picture here, as well as some ceramic coffins. We also have evidence of basketry. You can see some of the woven fabric here. And in this picture up here, we have evidence of a reed mat. Reed matting is usually associated with lower socioeconomic classes, is present in a few burials in one tomb. One of the administrative officials at Tombos was a man named Siamun, and we know this because his tomb included these ceramic items called funerary cones, and they were stamped with his name and title. He held the title scribe reckoner of the gold of Kush, so he was responsible for some of the gold production and the assembly of annual tribute in Nubia. In the middle-class chamber tomb area, we have the burial of a man of around 50 years of age in this decorated coffin. It's a bit hard to see with the bright sunlight and the shade that's in this picture, but you can see some red and black and white. There's some decoration, especially down this end, that was preserved. And there was the name and figure of the god Duamutef along with some large sections of inscription. And this was one of the first readable coffins that we found in Tombos during our second season in 2002. Inside the coffin, there were two figurines called Ushabti figurines alongside his legs. This is an example of what the Ushabti figurines can look like. And one of them in particular was down here and another one down here. They were somewhat damaged, but there was an inscription along the body of one of them. And this inscription contained this individual's name. His name was Tahut, and he had a standard spell from the Book of the Dead, the sort of Egyptian religious text that provided some information on what the deceased should do in the afterlife. Those Ushabti figurines were actually there to help the deceased in the afterlife, to do work for them in the divine fields. Tahut's skeleton showed that he lived with relatively few ailments and had strong muscle attachments. He did some physical labor in his life. He also had an unusual benign bone tumor on the front of his right pelvic bone, which we diagnosed as an osteochondroma. This is a benign growth. It's not uncommon, though this location is fairly rare and may have caused some physical discomfort. Most of the people in the Tombo cemetery were buried using Egyptian styles, as I mentioned, but there were several individuals who were all female that were laid to rest in the Nubian flex position seen here. You can see this female individual here. This burial was in the lowest level, the earliest level of a tomb containing many Egyptian style burials. This individual, while in the Nubian flex style, also had some Nubian jewelry around her neck. And this reflects the multicultural nature of the community, even from the very beginning. Strontium isotope analysis for all of these women buried in the Nubian style indicates that they were local residents. We see some particular Egyptian deities quite popular, especially Bes and Tawaret, who are associated with the protection of women and children. This woman seems kind of relaxed in her position with her arms out this way. Probably her arm used to be over her head this way. Usually that's the way many flexed burials were placed. Probably her arm was pushed aside when an ancient tomb robber grabbed the jewelry at her neck. It's very common to see evidence of ancient looting in these burials. In the Tumul cemetery, we had tumuli, large burial structures, maybe up to 10 meters in diameter, made of the granite boulders of varying sizes. And in many cases, there were a large number of stones found in the shaft that was dug out as well, that were possibly displaced by some of the ancient looters. And we've excavated about 30 of these now after the last season in 2020. Within these Nubian-style tumulus graves, we find skeletons that are in a more Egyptian-style position, so extended and on their back. You can see the skeleton here. However, we do have evidence of a couple of flexed burials. This is one from an earlier season in 2010. One of the tumulus burials had a burial in the Nubian style flexed positions, adult female lying on her side, flexed at the knees and elbows, and her hands by her head with her arms bent. We also uncovered the remains of a 5-year-old child. The skeleton was in good condition, and while in a more Egyptian extended position, the child's head was to the east, which is a more Nubian tradition. The child was wearing a necklace of small scarabs and glass beads with a gold clasp. So definitely a lot of intention in this child's burial, making sure that they had a nice burial as well. One of the tumuli also yielded the remains of a decayed basket. You can see sort of the edge of the basket here, very decayed over time. And it contained a variety of objects. You can see some of the vessels as well as sort of smaller objects there in this picture. Last season in 2020, we found almost all adult individuals except for this burial, which included a small baby. And based on the size of the bones, I estimate this individual to be a little bit less than full term, this fetus. So the burial goods and practices at Tombos tell us that it was important to adhere to particular traditions. In 2017, we found a full set of Canopic jars dedicated to a man named Happy. Happy was an individual who was a lector priest. So this is a priest who recited spells and hymns during temple rituals and official ceremonies. And these Canopic jars were used to hold the embalmed internal organs of the deceased who had undergone the most elaborate form of mummification. Ancient tomb robbers had likely broken these in the search for variables, but these jars did still contain the very degraded remains of internal organs. And this provided us with some secure documentation of organ removal at Tombos. As I mentioned, tomb robbing is known and documented in many ancient graves since early times in the Nile Valley. And so we find many burials that have already been disturbed by the ancient inhabitants. Once in a while, though, we are fortunate and find something that isn't too disturbed. So this is a drawing of one of our burials, and this niche over here was still covered by a mud brick wall. And inside, we found a burial inside of a coffin. This coffin had inlaid eyes and a black background that helped us determine when it was made. It's the New Kingdom period of the Egyptian colonial occupation. And inside this coffin, we see an elderly woman. She has elaborate grave goods, including this plaque amulet with the goddess Bat Hathor on one side and Tuat on the other. And she also has a finely carved serpentine heart scarab with a human head. You can see the head here, which provided her name, Weret, and a spell from the Book of the Dead. You can see the Book of the Dead that's written there. There were several ceramic containers and a bowl filled with juniper berries. This woman lived to fairly old age. She had poor dental health, which is common amongst many older individuals, but otherwise showed very few signs of sickness during her life. Another burial in the same area of the cemetery had some interesting physical conditions. This individual experienced prolonged paralysis in the lower half of the body based on a significant amount of atrophy in the long bones of her legs, as well as the pelvis. They're still in situ here, so you can't quite see them as well, When we compared these bones to bones from other people at the site, you could tell that they were much thinner and lacked the muscle attachments. She has a severe angle in her lower spine as well, as you can see here. And these traits are consistent with an individual having something like polio in childhood, which can result in paralysis as well as bone deformation, such as scoliosis of the spine. Polio-type conditions are attested in ancient Egyptian artistic depictions, though certainly it could have been another condition that caused paralysis. Further down in this tomb, I noted some unusual features of one individual in a small niche, and our conservator, Elizabeth Drolet, helped me consolidate the bones so we could remove them whole, because the bone preservation of this particular individual was fairly poor due to the damp conditions in the ground. This person, a female in her 40s or 50s, had limb bones that were much shorter on average, about half to 2/3 the normal size. They were also very robust with large muscle attachments, and some of them had ends that were misshapen. What we determined in looking through her skeleton, that she has signs of skeletal dysplasia, or an abnormal growth of her bones. And one possible diagnosis is dwarfism. One of my PhD students, Katie Whitmore, noted that one of the children buried in a basket in the shaft of this tomb also looked unusual. You can see the remains of the basket here. The bones, especially the forearm bones of this individual, this child, appeared misshapen in a similar way to what we saw in the adult I just showed you. The age of this child, based on dental development, is about 4 years old, while the age of the child, based on bone size, is closer to 1 year of age, suggesting that this child also had a condition that affected limb growth. The body appears much smaller than expected for the size of the skull. And dwarfism, which can be caused by several conditions, is something that can be passed from parent to child. So it's possible that these individuals could be related in this tomb. In ancient Egyptian society, we see dwarves being held in holding very high positions, serving pharaohs in the administration, and we also see several dwarf gods in the Egyptian religion. Along with many ceramic, wooden, stone grave goods, we also have a few examples of animals in the graves. Many of you may be familiar with the site of Kerma, where there are many bucrania, so the cattle skulls buried with the large tumulus graves at Kerma. We don't have anything that extensive at Tombos, but we did find the burial of a horse in one tomb. This is one of only 3 non-royal horse burials in Nubia, and also a small dog that was placed at the foot of a woman, a flexed Nubian burial. She was over the decayed remains of a large basket and on top of the remnants of a woven mat and wearing a leather garment. Interestingly, we did some radiocarbon dating on this skeleton and found that this burial is actually one that we would call intrusive, meaning it was not buried during the time when the tomb was built, which was the New Kingdom period, but actually a much later time period, probably Meroitic times. So more than 1,000 years later, this individual, some people decided to use this older tomb and bury a couple of individuals. Last season, we continued to excavate in a previously found pyramid structure. And this shaft, this is a picture of Mohamed Faroug Ali. The shaft of the chapel is quite interesting. You can see around here that the shaft is lined in rock. And this is different from many of our other structures, which were usually lined in mud brick. So we have the stone lining, which is quite unique. And we know that this is likely during the period after the Egyptian occupation of Nubia. And this suggests that we have a long continuity at Tombos and innovation in pyramid tomb building at Tombos by people after the Egyptians had left. And we hope to continue excavation next season to understand this new kind of structure. Overall, we have tombs at Tombos that are reflective of local Nubian traditions in terms of the superstructure style, like the tumulus graves, but they also display extended body position and some artifacts that are traditionally associated with Egypt. We know that it was common for Nubians during the time period of Egyptian colony to take on Egyptian cultural practices. Interaction between groups in the Nile Valley over the millennia indicates that these traditions that may have once been considered foreign might have become familiar over time and maybe not have been used in the same way as seen in other areas. So things that may have been considered Egyptian and foreign may have been adopted and used in new ways that became really wholly Nubian or local over time. So it's possible that these elements may not have been consciously recognized as foreign by subsequent generations of these Egyptian Nubian families. And these entangled practices demonstrate the multi-directional influence and usage of cultural practices that resulted in hybrid forms that likely eroded this distinction between local and foreign during this time period. Through my work over the last couple decades at Tombos, it has been great to introduce the modern community of Tombos to the ancient inhabitants. And we're keenly aware that many of us working on the Tombos project are outsiders, and we're making discoveries about the cultural heritage of those in Sudan. So we have tried over the years and will continue to try to make a concerted effort to involve the local community in our research design and communication of our work. We have always found the community of Tombos to be wonderfully friendly and welcoming, and we live and work with them during our excavations. They express a lot of pride in their Nubian heritage and enjoy hearing about what we found. At Tombos, we've worked with different groups of people. So we often give a talk in the local football club, which is generally attended by the adult men of the community. I have recently started giving talks for the women in the community as well, since they don't work at the site with us and they don't usually come to the football club. And we've started lectures at the local school to the kids, as well as a site tour. Some of our work has also included preparing some materials that the teachers requested in order to teach about archaeology in their schools. So our team members are working towards more activities and better ways to understand what the local community would like to know about the research and how they would like to be involved. This man pictured here was actually one of our workers on the archaeological site in our first season in 2000, and he eventually became a school teacher and was very excited to have these posters to teach about the Tombos site. Another initiative, this is spearheaded by Dr. Mohamed Faroug, is the American Sudanese Archaeological Research Center, known as AMSARC. And it's an independent, not-for-profit organization founded in California in 2017. And our mission is to encourage American and Sudanese archaeological research and collaboration in Sudan, and to provide a network for support and success. We're currently working to expand our membership, so please feel free to check out our AMSARC webpage if you're interested in more information. Mohamed and I have been working hard to try to expand educational opportunities, and we were awarded funding from the Fulbright Specialist Program to host a bioarchaeology workshop at the International University of Africa in Khartoum. And we hope to continue to talk with the administration about regular workshops and the development of a curriculum in bioarchaeology. While there are archaeology departments in Sudan where many Sudanese have gained training, bioarchaeology, so specifically looking at the skeletons themselves, is not a specialty that is really represented in the universities in Sudan. So our goal is to build capacity for bioarchaeology and the infrastructure for Sudanese to take these classes and earn degrees. My colleague and team member, Rima Abdulreem, has taken a strong interest in these topics and will be our partner in workshops as we build training opportunities. I hope that you have enjoyed a few of my tales from Tombos today. My own community, so meaning my son and my husband, were actually able to join me last season in 2020. Yeah, 2020. And that was a lot of fun. After spending 20 years at Tombos, it was really a joy for me to introduce my son, my husband, to the community. And my son Elliot really enjoyed his visit and can't wait to go back to Sudan again. So I appreciate you taking time out of your day to attend to my talk. I'd like to acknowledge my major grant supporters for this work, which are the National Science Foundation for this last season and the strontium isotope work, as well as the National Geographic Society. Purdue University has provided a lot of support for my research. We, of course, have the cooperation of the local antiquities service and my terrific team at Tombos. This is a picture of our last team. Shukran, I'd be happy to answer questions if anybody has any. So I will stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to take any questions.
Let me start with one question. How does the strontium work, the isotope?
Yeah, so strontium is an element that is part of the bedrock. Right, so the strontium isotope values that you see in the ground are a reflection of the age and composition of the rocks in the local area. So the Third Cataract region is characterized by the outcrops of granite, and the granite has a different strontium isotope signature than, for instance, the limestone that we see in parts of Egypt, where colonists would likely have come from during the Egyptian colonial period. So what I was doing is comparing the strontium isotope values in the individuals who were buried at Tombos to see if they match the local area, meaning they were local to the region, were born and raised in the region, or if they had a strontium isotope value that was closer to what we see in Egypt, providing some evidence that we had immigrants at the site.
I don't see any questions, although I'm not very good at this. Muntasir, do you see any questions or hands raised?
No, I don't see. There is a question. There is one question now.
Okay. So this is from Farid Zain. He's asking if there is any evidence of what led to the decline of this advanced civilization, either at the Tombos or in Nubia in general.
So what we've excavated at Tombos generally is concentrated into the Egyptian period. So this, as I mentioned, this town was established during the Egyptian period about 1450 BC, but continues after the fall of the Egyptian Empire. And so while many researchers in the past had posited that, there was a large decline after the Egyptian colonial period, we don't see that at all. So we see this town of Tombos continuing to thrive for several hundred years after the fall of the Egyptian kingdom, into the time period when Nubia was ruling Egypt. At this specific site, we have, as I mentioned, a few burials that date into the Meroitic, but all over Nubia in general, we see continued occupation. So I don't really see a large decline at all. I mean, I see changes over time that likely had to do with perhaps changes in the climate, access to resources. People moved into different areas. After the New Kingdom, we see most of the Nubian administrators, the rulers, in the south, so Napata and then further south to Merowe once that time period goes. So we see continued occupation in Nubia, although the location of where most of the sites are does change a bit over time.
And there is also a question from Bakr Abdel Majid. Do you plan to expand your research north or south of Tombos?
Yeah, so the Tombos team currently is working at the site of Abu Fatma. And Abu Fatma is in between Tombos and Kerma, so a little bit south. And it is a site that dates to the Kerma period, so the ancient, middle, and classic Kerma periods. And this is interesting to us. Dr. Sarah Schrader, who is my PhD student, who finished her PhD some years ago, is the director of this site. And we're interested in what the Nubians were doing before the Egyptians showed up. So that will give us a better perspective on what's happening in that area. So those are the two areas we're concentrating our work right now.
Okay. I don't see any questions. However, there is a comment from Mohamed Nasser saying that thank you very much for this presentation and amazing work in Tombos. And he said we would appreciate if you produce some documentaries about the site and discoveries and to contribute to our knowledge. I did post the tombos.org for the website, but do you have any plans to do a documentary as such?
Yeah, so we, some of the Tombos team members have been involved in a few things that have happened on a larger scale. They tend to not just focus on one site, but larger ones. So we don't have any immediate plans for a documentary, but if you look on the tombos.org or the amsarc.org, there's a link to the piece that I wrote for the conversation, which is, I think, maybe where you heard about my research. And that was one way for me to try to get more attention to the work being done in Sudan and the work that we're doing with our Sudanese colleagues. And so based on that, there is an article that is being written on the New Scientist, in the New Scientist, about Nubia and Sudan. And all of these things help build interest. And so there are a few documentaries that have come out over the last couple of years. They tend to focus on the sites that have things that are visible above the ground. So especially Jebel Barkal and Nuri and El Kuru and Merowe as well, because of the very visible pyramids. So we did have pyramids at Tombos, but they're all mostly gone except for just the foundations of them. So we will certainly do what we can to try to bring more attention and participate whenever we can.
Yeah, I actually have another question. We have these little pyramids in Sudan. What would be the way to actually date the building of these pyramids? Is it carbon dating, or what do you do?
So the pyramids in Sudan, they're mostly at the site of Merowe and Napata. And so I would say generally they are dated by the artifacts that are found in them. And many of these artifacts have inscriptions on them that tell us about who the leader was during that time. And so that gives us a pretty good way to date them. Some of them might have some remains that can be carbon dated as well, but the preservation of remains really determines how accurate that date would be. So I would say most of them are based on the artifacts, the style of the artifacts, as well as artifacts that have inscriptions on them.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any further questions,
I have one.
Okay, I'm missing something here. Okay,
yeah, I have one myself quickly.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Professor Buzon. And So as somebody who is very interested, like all of us, like all Sudanese are very interested in this kind of work, but we don't necessarily have the domain knowledge, of course. It would be it would be like a dream come true, you know, if we see some sort of where those civilizations were, from evidence, from your research work and other people who have done research, and see some sort of like a time lapse, you know, how these civilizations move in space and time, and how did they retract. Something that we can share even with our kids and families, and get more knowledge. I'm just wondering, like, if there is something close to that, or if you're working on something similar to that.
Yeah, so there are some resources available, and I can email you after the talk with some resources that I know are available. So about, let's see, 15 years ago, more than 15 years ago now, when people were gearing up for the Fourth Cataract Dam, there was a large campaign of archaeologists working. More than 50 teams were working in Sudan. And some of these teams were funded by QSAP, which is the Qatar Sudanese Archaeological Project. And one of the requirements of the money from Qatar was to produce things for the community. So there are actually a number of booklets that came out of this, and they are in both English and Arabic. So I can email some of those, and please, you know, feel free to share them with your colleagues. And so that's one resource that's available. There's a few websites that I know are available as well. And you know, one of the barriers that we see is that much of the knowledge produced by foreign archaeologists is not in Arabic, of course, right? And so that's one of our goals, is to start translating more of our work into Arabic. The Tombos website is translated into Arabic for most of the posts, and we're trying to provide more resources that way. So those posters that we made for the local school, the teachers requested both Arabic and English in order to learn more English, but also be able to understand in Arabic. So there are some resources available. Mohamed and I are working on a book for the local Tombos area. And there's a number of projects that are producing materials as we speak. So I'm happy to share the ones that are available, and happy to report that more is being done.
Thank you so much. And you just made like 100 or more than 100 friends now from the Sudanese American in this community, in this association. So thank you for that. Back to you.
Yes, another question from Farid Zain. Are you aware of any similar work done in the burial sites in Egypt that show Nubian burial traditions during the Napatan rule over Egypt?
Okay, so Nubian burial traditions in Egypt during the Napatan rule. There are not very many burial sites in Egypt that have been excavated to this particular time period. I can't even think of one. There's certainly evidence of Nubians in the Aswan area, Egyptian and Nubian burial practices in that, which would have been the border region of ancient Nubia and ancient Egypt during that time period. I can't think of one burial site in Egypt during that time period, which doesn't mean they don't exist, but simply means it hasn't been discovered yet or hasn't been excavated yet, right? So I don't have a good example of that. However, if you look at other sites that date to the Napatan period, we see Nubian influence on Egyptian practices during this time, certainly. Maybe not specifically in burials, but during, with inscriptions and other depictions of the Nubian pharaohs.
Okay.
I saw one more question in the chat.
Okay.
Is there a program to enlarge and assess the addition of topics in schools in Nubia, in the curriculum in schools in Nubia? So this is an interesting question. During the 20 years that I have been working there, I would say that there has been a shift over time. So when we first started going there, the teachers would say, we have no resources for teaching about archaeology. We don't learn about it in schools. But over the last 3 to 5 years, this has changed. So the school teachers in Tombos are telling us that they're learning more when they go to school to become teachers about Nubian history, and they have some, at least some kind of materials available, and they're starting to teach about it more in the schools in Tombos. Now, I don't know if that is widespread throughout Sudan, but at least is in our local area, it has started to happen, and that is exciting for us to see, because we had found that many people don't know the ancient history and are not taught that in schools, and we'd like to try to help to provide resources.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see any more questions or comments. So thank you very much for joining us. This has been great. Thank you for your work, and I hope you continue.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure for me to be here and to speak to Sudanese. And I will send you a follow-up email with some resources that you're welcome to share with your association.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Have a nice afternoon.
Yes, so this lecture is recorded and it will be on the ASAPA website. Thank you.
Bye-bye.